You found the skeleton. How would you calculate that design? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here, ready to keep tackling Andrew Snelling, one of the most blatantly dishonest creationists I know of. If you haven't already, please remember to like this video, and if you're not subscribed yet, it takes only a few seconds. Then you can turn on all notifications so you're always notified when there's new Dapper Dino content. Now without further ado, here's Andy.
So, if the flood really occurred, what evidence would you and I expect to find? It's a logical question, isn't it?
Yes it is. And what we should expect is probably an unconformity that is global in scale, followed by a global turbidite deposit combining organisms from all ecosystems sorted by hydrological principles, and for this deposit to be highly graded and quite extensive vertically. Why would we expect that? Well, because that's what floods leave behind. And if it happened everywhere, it would be left behind everywhere. Of course, after this, instead of giving us an answer, he just tells us to answer questions with questions.
All flesh died. Wouldn't you expect to find billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down all over the earth? And that's exactly what we find.
But just having lots of fossils doesn't actually indicate whether science or creationism is right. Both predict finding fossils. You have to look at the areas where there is disagreement in the predictions in order to differentiate between the two.
70% of the earth is covered of the continents is covered in fossil-bearing sedimentary rocks laid down by water.
But what about fossil-bearing rock laid down by air, like the Coconino Sandstone, the Dakota Formation in Mongolia, or the Ashfall fossil beds in Nebraska? They weren't formed by a flood, not even by water.
But how do you get a fossil fish in the first place?
A fish dies and is covered by sediment faster than it can rot away. Then over time, the organic tissues may be replaced by minerals which keep the shape of the original fish. Note though that in some environments, rotting is extremely slow, like in bodies of water with anoxic conditions at the bottom, which means that even quite slow sedimentation deposition can be fast enough to create a fossil.
Look at the beautiful state of preservation of that fish. Well, here's a fish about to have his breakfast, doesn't get time to swallow it before he's buried and fossilized. You get the point?
Nothing about that fossils requires the fish to have been buried alive. Fish today die from trying to swallow things that they can't really fit in their throat or that are too sharp. Nothing here implies a flood.
You can't preserve a fossil like that where he's just about to take a chomp and he's frozen in an instant.
Well, first, that isn't what had to have happened to form that fossil, and realizing that isn't even something that takes expertise. Just basic logic will get you there. That wasn't a fish about to take a bite. It tried to bite off more than it could handle. It may in fact have died rather slowly, and probably in some significant distress.
That's a marine reptile, 6 feet long, giving birth to a baby.
First, kudos to Snelling for getting it right that this is a reptile. Kent Hovind seems to think it's some kind of ray-fin fish, because he's an idiot. Second, that's certainly a baby exiting the mother's reproductive system, but it's not clear that this is an instance of live birth. It could instead be coffin birth. Coffin birth is known in many animals, humans included. When a pregnant female dies, decay gases can build up in the womb, which then pushes the infant out of the reproductive tract as the gas escapes into the environment. It's not clear if that is what happened here, but Snelling simply ignores that possibility.
1 minute, mother is about to give birth to a baby. Split second later, she's buried in tons and tons of mud.
Creationists do love this specimen, in part I think because it's nearly impossible to track down scholarly publications on it. I do think I've managed to find the publication describing the fossil. Unfortunately, it seems to be a book in German with no digitized edition. Fortunately though, it seems to be a German specimen of Stenopterygius, an early Jurassic ichthyosaur. Given that I managed to find numerous papers describing locations in Germany for such fossils, but not for the specific specimen, I think I can say a thing or two about it. Turns out that they are all from the Posidonia shale in southwest Germany. That shale is a bit coarser than others, but shows no signs of flocculation, or at least I couldn't find a single paper mentioning floccules in that deposit. And so while it was probably deposited faster than, say, the Bright Angel shale, it still probably took a long time to deposit overall. So no, this fossil was not buried rapidly because the rock it was found in couldn't have been deposited quickly. In other words, Snelling is once again lying about tons of mud, since, that'd be mudstone and not shale. And I remind you, this man is a geologist.
Fossilization had to be catastrophic, virtually instant and rapid.
Amazing. Every word of what you just said was wrong.
Here's a fossilized jellyfish. Jellyfish are soft. They melt in the sun or get ripped apart by the wind and the waves.
Oh, so now I have to take back the kudos I gave Andrew here for getting it right the fossil was a reptile. because this is an Ediacaran trace fossil called Mawsonite spriggi. No one knows for sure what it is, and it's not the body of an organism, it's more likely a holdfast or burrow. Of all the proposed identities for this fossil, jellyfish is the least well supported. I also want to note that this is from rock that Snelling himself says shouldn't have fossils at all. Think about that. He went to all these lengths to tell us that the flood starts at the beginning of the Paleozoic rock systems, and that we don't have much in the way of fossils besides trace fossils and microbes before that. Yet here we are with what he thinks is an animal fossil that requires rapid burial, except it's in rock that he says wasn't laid down catastrophically. And of course, this wasn't laid down catastrophically. It was in a sequence of some 27 vertical beds of coarse-grained feldspathic sandstone that preserves in-situ ecosystems with multiple generations. It isn't turbidite. That particular fossil was described in 1966 by Martin F. Glassner and is from the Nilpa fossil site in South Australia, in case anyone cares. Link in the description.
Or these crinoids. Look at the heads of those crinoids or coelides. They're delicate. They have been preserved.
You notice how he doesn't actually tell us where these fossils were found so we can check the sedimentology ourselves? Because I sure have noticed that. Weird, isn't it? It's almost like he knows he's full of it and doesn't want to let his audience in on it. Well, this time it worked. I couldn't find that specimen like I did with that almost certainly not a jellyfish. So instead, I'm going to simply use that specimen as a proxy for crinoid specimens generally. So for those who don't know, crinoids are echinoderms, along with sea stars, sea urchins, sea cucumbers, etc. And you'll probably not be surprised to learn that there is also a nickname for crinoids, with the word sea in it. They are called sea lilies, even though they are not plants, but animals. Now, just a month ago, as of this writing, I was at the Grand Canyon with some people from the internet land. One of the easiest rock formations of the canyon to see is the Red Wall Limestone, an 800-foot sheer cliff of red limestone. And guess what? It has crinoid fossils in it. And the problem with limestone is that flood conditions basically preclude the formation of limestone. Limestone forms fastest under calm, warm, low-pressure, low-acidity water. You know what that sounds like? It's the opposite of a flood. And even if the flood were calm, warm, which I guess it sure would be, since, no one has solved the heat problem, low pressure and non-acidic, giving limestone its best possible chance to deposit, it would still take nearly 5,000 years at optimal conditions to form the Red Wall Limestone. And let's not forget that it's also in the middle of the canyon, which makes no sense, since the calcium carbonate that the limestone is made up of has no reason to selectively come out of solution only in the middle of the flood. For an even deeper dive, see the video linked above by Gutsick Gibbon, who will serve up more than 20 minutes of why limestone doesn't work in a flood.
Or the wings of this wasp. How do you fossilize a wasp like that if it's not rapidly and catastrophically buried?
Interestingly, this specimen is literally the first thing that shows up on a Google image search for the term fossil wasp. It's a specimen of Paleovespa florescentia, which is found in the Florissant Formation of Teller County, Colorado, hence the name. While that formation is known for a potential few flood rock layers, and some of it probably resulted from a lahar, which is a violent mudflow, this fossil seems to be from the shale portions of the formation based on the very fine grains, although I will be honest, I was unable to track down a source describing the exact location in which this particular fossil was found. But here's the interesting bit. This fossil is from Oligocene rocks, which according to Answers in Genesis, and therefore Snelling, is post-flood rock. So in order to convince us that only the Genesis flood could create such fossils, he's showing us a fossil that according to him could not possibly have formed in the flood, because when it formed, the flood was over. So far, of the 3 fossils he's shown us in this section, only one of them is actually even from rock that he would say is flood rock. It's almost like he didn't bother to research any of these specimens and just googled fossil wasp and went with the first image, because at the cost of repeating myself, this is the fossil you get as the first result when you do that.
Or flowers. These are soft organisms that would not be preserved. I mean, you get a flower today and leave it out, what's going to happen to it? It's going to wither, die, and fall apart. No, to preserve these organisms, you need rapid, catastrophic deposition on a mass scale.
This specimen was the 23rd result on a Google image search for a fossil flower. It's an unidentified flower from the Green River Formation, and it's unidentified precisely because, as Snelling said about plants, it has fallen apart, and important identifying parts of the flower are gone. Another interesting thing about the Green River Formation is that it has such regular and cyclic depositions that tiny variations in the orbit of the Earth can be detected in it. Good luck with that during a 1-year flood. But also, once again, this is from rock that Snelling doesn't consider flood rock. So 3 out of 4 of the examples of fossils that could only be formed during the flood of Noah were not formed during it, even according to Snelling. At this point, I expect that in order to convince you that Snelling only used homegrown vegetables at home, He'd hand you a bunch of cucumbers that all still have the supermarket sticker on them. The very examples he's giving refute his main point unless Answers in Genesis wants to move their flood boundary. But given their long-standing feud with the Institute for Creation Research over this very bone of contention, I doubt that's going to happen anytime soon.
So, what do the fossils show?
Well, these fossils show that Snelling is either a liar, unbelievably lazy, or a moron. I'm not completely sure which one, but I'm leaning towards both liar and unbelievably lazy.
They show evidence of death, disease, and destruction.
That's true.
They show evidence of rapid burial in a catastrophe, the flood. They also show evidence of sudden appearance, fully formed and complex, without any ancestors in the layers beneath them.
Okay, well let's look at that. For the first fossil that Snelling pretends is a jelly, but almost certainly is not, we don't know enough about it to say what its ancestors would be, since we really have no idea what it is. But let's look at the crinoid. As I've stated, crinoids are echinoderms, and interestingly, while they, along with all extant echinoderms, show radial symmetry, they all develop from bilaterally symmetrical larvae, and genetically they are actually closer to vertebrates than they are to animals like mollusks or insects. And all of those groups are bilaterally symmetrical. So if evolution is true, then echinoderms evolved from something that was bilaterally symmetrical as an adult, and so we should expect to see some very early bilaterally symmetrical echinoderms in the fossil record. What do you know? But that we do find them in the Cambrian. Animals such as Protoctinus mensellianus, Tenocytus utaensis, and Tenoimbricata spinosa. Probably mangled some of those. But they're all from the Cambrian. Weird how the exact morphological intermediates expected if evolution were true is exactly what we find, even though Snelling said we shouldn't find them. Okay, let's look at the wasp. Well, this one is fairly easy. That wasp was found in the Cenozoic, but way back at the beginning of the Mesozoic, in the Triassic period, we find the first species of wasp in Xylidae, the most basal hymenopterans around. You would barely recognize them as wasps, and they are not usually even called wasps, but sawflies, even though they are not true flies. And within Hymenoptera, we have both genetic, morphological, and fossil data that tell us all we really need to know about the evolution of sawflies, wasps, bees, and ants. We have lots of ancestral forms for the paper wasp that Snelling showed us. Well, now we're on to the flower. So flowers presumably evolved from non-flowering plants, so we should expect our earliest flowering plants to not really have full flowers. And what do you know? The early Cretaceous plant, Archifructus, has carpels and stamens, the reproductive organs, simply on the end of long stems with no petals or sepals to protect them or attract pollinators. Weird how before we get the first widespread flowering plants towards the end of the Cretaceous and the beginning of the Paleogene, we get things that have only the most basic parts of a flower and have yet to actually develop all the fancy bits you or I would associate with flowers. It's almost like flowers do have evolutionary ancestors in the fossil record, and Andrew Snelling is a liar.
Let me unpack that for you. Even a simple cell is complex. You ask any microbiologist who looks down a microscope, and they will tell you that the cell you can fit on the size of a pinpoint, is incredibly complex. In fact, one biologist said, the cell is as complex as a city the size of New York or London.
So far, this whole argument is just, gee whiz, ain't that neat, mister? Must have been a miracle. That's not an argument. Further, when did we jump to the origin of the eukaryotic cell? To explain the common ancestry of echinoderms, angiosperms, and vespids, we don't need to go nearly that far back. And remember, these were his examples of evolution. So even if it were true that the origin of the eukaryotic cell couldn't fit within an evolutionary paradigm, that doesn't mean that those organisms couldn't have had a common ancestor. And let's remember, if echinoderms and insects share common ancestry, then so do humans, dinosaurs, and insects, because we're closer to echinoderms than to insects.
Because it's got a brain, a control center, or a nucleus, it's got transport networks, it's got factories, it's got powerhouses, it's got all the ingredients that make up a mega city with all its complexity.
I was hoping he'd make an argument, but no. Here's a hint to creationists. Complexity per se is not an argument for design, because both design and evolution predict that organisms will be complex. And in fact, evolution would tend to predict that organisms may end up being more complex than necessary due to the fact that evolution can only tinker. It can't wipe the slate clean and come up with a simpler, more efficient design, like an intelligent designer could. So any complexity that is past the minimum actually argues against design.
So what do we find in the fossil record? We go from life to complex life.
Right? Isn't that what we'd expect based on evolution? What's the argument here? Maybe he'll clarify in a bit.
Cells, fully formed, fully functioning, ready.
Maybe, maybe not. It's not clear how we'd identify a fossil protocell, or even if such a thing would be likely to fossilize in the first place. So it's not a surprise that the first organisms we see are the ones that 1. Can easily fossilize, and 2. We can recognize as fossils. That doesn't really say anything about what came before them. Plus, if he's talking about the Cambrian, then at best he's arguing for separate ancestry of the eukaryotic kingdom level taxa, which is way, way more common ancestry than he'd actually admit to. Basically, an argument that you're not related to a pine tree isn't an argument that you're not related to an elephant.
It's the same no matter what level we look at. These flatworms.
You mean Dickinsonia, one of the most primitive bilaterians in the fossil record, which may be transitional to segmented organisms like the panarthropods, and which are found in rocks too old to be flood rocks according to Snelling? Sure, what about them?
There's no hint of any ancestors in the layers below them. They appear suddenly in the fossil record, fully formed, fully complex.
I guess Icaria wariutia doesn't exist then. Oh wait, yes it does. It's an even more primitive bilaterian from some 10 to 50 million years before Dickinsonia. Ouch, that must feel bad for Snelling.
Like this trilobite. Most people think, well, that's 3 lobes. Trilobite, 3 lobes. It's got 3 sections to its body. By the way, you see it's got a head. That's the left-hand end. See those 2 knobs? That's the eyes of the trilobite. They've been fossilised.
Are we in for a pointless but reasonably accurate lesson on trilobite anatomy? I mean, that's better than blatant lies, so let's find out.
Our lenses, not these things that I have to wear, but inside here, the lenses in my eyes are made up of organic tissue. Not so the trilobite eyes. The lenses are made up of lime, the same mineral that's in limestone, calcite.
It's true that they are made of calcite, which interestingly ties back to the limestone that we already talked about. You see, in many, if not most limestone beds, the origin of the calcium carbonate is actually biological. It's the skeletons of dead plankton. And given that limestone formations can exceed 1,000 feet in thickness, they represent more plankton than could possibly have lived during the flood of Noah. Because if they had been alive, they essentially would have been the floodwater. The ocean would just be a sludge of plankton, which would have prevented most of them from photosynthesizing.
And we can actually study the fossilised eye of the trilobite, and here it is. It's made up of multiple lenses, all focusing in different directions at the same time. Incredibly complex, so this creature could look in all directions and have everything in focus while he scurried across the ocean floor.
Okay, that's cool, but I really hope there's a point coming.
We, with our ingenuity, have only made similar lens systems in the last 50 years by intelligent input and design.
It's only in the last few decades that humans have been able to make artificial gems. Does that mean that gems had to be specifically intelligently designed by God? The inability of humans to reproduce a natural phenomenon does not imply that that phenomenon has no natural cause.
It's like this. Millions of years of wind and water obviously carved out the president's head. You and I can all see the evidence of intelligent planning, design, and input.
Yeah, we don't see statues of humans without the signs of human activity like tool marks. Interestingly, we have yet to see a biological organism out in the wild with signs of human activity. But we do see evolution occurring all over the place. So in a situation where you have a no natural cause and no indication of any artificial interference, why would you just assume that it's not a natural phenomenon? I don't know, maybe lightning really is Thor's displeasure.
There was Stephen Hawking using a voice synthesizer to be able to communicate with us, built by intelligent engineers who designed it, and yet he used that system to tell us we all got here by chance.
Humans can't make a thing, therefore nature can't make other things. That's the argument. Non sequitur et mendax est, Snelling.
So what do the fossils show? Evidence of death, disease and destruction.
Yes.
Evidence of rapid burial.
Sometimes.
Evidence of sudden appearance.
No.
Evidence of design by an intelligent creator. We've just dealt with that.
He didn't deal with that at all. He asserted it based on the unargued for assumption that complexity requires design. But that does not follow. I wish I could have countered an argument about complexity implying design, but he simply failed to give one, and apparently is now just moving on.
And the evidence of no evolutionary transitions. Where are the missing links?
Well, I already showed some for the echinoderms, angiosperms, and hymenopterans. So, they're right where we expect them to be.
That hypothetically link one type of creature to another. Like here, half a reptile, half a bird.
Hey look, it's Ornithomimus. And here comes Psittapati. And don't look now, but it's Archaeopteryx. Who's this next? It's Anchiornis. And what do you know? But I see a Microraptor.
By the way, Stephen Jay Gould recognised this problem. He was known to, and he was arguably the greatest evolutionist of the 20th century, and he made this comment: what use is half a wing or half a jaw? Think about it.
I have thought about it. In fact, I'll link to my 15-minute video all about what good half a wing is. It turns out that if you're in an environment where extending your glide slope during a fall is good, then half a wing is really advantageous. That's why lots of animals like sugar gliders, colugos, flying frogs, flying fish, flying squirrels, etc. have half a wing. As for half a jaw, it's good for holding onto food while you use other appendages to move it to your mouth. I mean, that's not exactly rocket science.
A reptile that's on its way to becoming a bird, its legs are changing into wings.
Nope, those limbs were already arms that it wasn't walking on.
So when they're halfway there, they're not very good for running, and they're not very good for flying, so how does it survive?
They weren't being used for running, but for grasping, and the first bird wings were still good for grasping. Further, even the full wings of pterosaurs were good for running, as we have lots of pterosaur tracks that indicate that they were not clumsy on the ground, despite walking on their wings. So even if he were right about the transition going from leg to wings in birds, rather than from leg to arm to wing, so what? That apparently wasn't a problem for pterosaurs. Why would it be for birds? And while the earliest dinosaur wings weren't great for flying, they were okay at extending glide slope, which, as we know from modern extant animals, can provide an advantage in both avoiding predation and finding food and mates. All the while, the arm function isn't lost, because they can still grasp until so far into bird evolution that flight becomes the dominant mode of locomotion, and flight characteristics take precedence over grasping ability, and at which point the skull starts changing to have more cranial kinesis, so that the mouth can more finely manipulate food, and in the case of corvids, even tools. Because yeah, crows have technology.
Feathers are more than scales. They're totally different. A bird is more than feathers. A bird has a different lung system, it has a different heart system, a circulation system. It's radically different from a reptile.
Feathers are more than scales, but they're not really all that different. They develop from the same proteins and via the same regulatory network as crocodile scales, but the signaling cascade is different. That is, the same genes in crocodiles form scales as form feathers in birds. They just express at different times. In fact, if you're careful, you can get an alligator to grow basic feathers as an embryo. As for different respiratory systems, we know that many dinosaurs, including those thought to be closest to birds, actually had the avian-style respiratory system. So it's still a question as to how dinosaurs got it, but it's not a question of relevance to the idea that birds evolved from dinosaurs. As for the heart system, like their archosaur cousins, birds have four-chambered hearts, and while crocodilians now bypass one of the chambers, birds do not, indicating that again this probably goes all the way back to at least Archosauria, and it isn't a question of how birds evolved from dinosaurs. Basically, this is the same thing as arguing that because he doesn't know how hair could evolve from scales, that rats can't have evolved from mammals because they have hair. It's complete nonsense. And as for the hearts, basically they started as simple muscles. Then through simple infolding they gained valves that could lessen the mixing of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. Then the muscles around these new chambers started to be out of sync, further increasing efficiency. All of this is produced by simple changes in the embryonic development of whether cells are signaled to fold, grow, or die, which is all that happens at that stage of ontology. Cells fold, they grow, they die, or they do nothing. The four-chambered heart is not a barrier or problem for evolution. It's actually reasonably straightforward compared to some things.
And in the fossil record, whenever we find skeletons that look like birds, they are true birds.
Yeah, are they though? Because AIG's own David Menton seems to think that Velociraptor is a bird, but the Creation Museum, also run by Answers in Genesis, still presents it as a scaly dinosaur. So maybe it's not so clear.
Archaeopteryx was once said to be the ancestor of the birds.
Not really. Maybe very early on that was proposed, but it's not likely the ancestor of extant birds. Rather, it's an example of a morphological transition between basocoelurosaurian dinosaurs and avian dinosaurs. Evolution predicts that we should find such transitions, whereas creationism merely accommodates them. But neither really requires any given transitional form to be directly ancestral to modern groups.
But we know it was a true bird with true feathers.
If having true feathers makes you a bird, then you're going to get a lot of dinosaurs that aren't too bird-like to be birds. I'm not really sure Snelling wants to say that Eutyrannus is a bird. Further, what's a true feather? Are the hair-like feathers of the kiwi or the cassowary true feathers? I don't know, because Snelling has yet to bother to tell us.
Yes, it had claws on its wings and it had teeth in its bill, but we've got living birds with claws on their wings and teeth in their bill.
First, Archaeopteryx had no bill or beak, which all living birds do. Second, yes, some living birds have claws. More than you probably realize, dear audience. But no living bird has teeth. Some have beak serrations, though.
Or this so-called transition from fish to amphibians, fins changing into legs. While the fins are partway fins, partway legs. Oh, it's also got to have the lung system, hasn't it, to breathe on air, on land as well as in the water. So it's got to change at the same time. What if it doesn't all change at the same time? The creature comes to a dead end and dies.
Man, if only lungs hadn't already evolved in fish from diverticulae of the digestive system, and then later on in some other fish, the same organ evolved into a swim bladder, while continuing to be lungs in organisms like tetrapods and the lungfish, which is, the extant sister group to tetrapods. And it's called a lungfish because it has these organs called lungs.
Just like it can't swim very well or walk very well.
Actually, it can swim very well with those robust neural arches in the tail supporting a flat and tall surface, much like that of a modern crocodilian. As for walking, well, it didn't really need to walk well. It probably just walked to get out of the water and avoid large, piscine predators. Once you're on land with nothing bigger than a scorpion to threaten you, as would be the case for the first tetrapods, you don't actually need to walk well to get to the next pond. Further, we can see modern fish who are not exactly efficient walkers, but who nonetheless manage to walk across land to get to new bodies of water. An example that comes to mind is the walking catfish, and I'll let you guess why they're called that. And here's a hint. It's not because they never leave the water.
Oh, by the way, they touted a missing link between these two. They called it Titilak.
Titilak? Did Titilak have a tibula, just like Australopithecus? It's Tiktaalik.
By the way, how many bones did they actually find? That's what they found. Can you see the evidence there of fins changing the legs? What was missing?
Yes, I can see the evidence of fins turning into legs, with the separation of the pectoral girdle from the cranium as well as the increased general robustness compared to other stegocephalians. And while I can't make it out in this fossil, and the paper The Pectoral Fin of Tiktaalik rosier and the Origin of the Tetrapod Limb did describe its internal fin anatomy. So what's missing is basically the back half, but of course it's only missing in that photo. The back half wasn't described until after the front portion, and so isn't always in photographs of the find. Let's see what Andrew thinks is missing, shall we?
The artist's imagination.
What? What is he talking about? I honestly have no clue what point he's trying to make here.
Because you see, when you find a whole skeleton, you can see the feet or you can see the fins. You don't see anything in between.
But that Tiktaalik specimen does have foot-like fins. They're just pressed against and under the body, so in the picture showing the fossil from above, you can't see them. This is just looking at a coin with the head side up and concluding that it doesn't have a tail side because you can't see it. We have reached flat earth levels of logic here. Like seriously, we are dealing with something that humans normally can figure out at about 8 months old. That just because you can't see something right now doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Of course, it also just might maybe be the case that Snelling is smarter than an 8-month-old infant, and is just a liar.
Oh, and by the way, they later found footprints of vertebrate animals below where they found Titilak.
Tiktaalik.
So they knew that
Tiktaalik
couldn't be the ancestor of the four-footed animals because there were already four-footed animals around.
Right, as is normal for even extant transitional species, like the pipefish, which is transitional between basal Signathiformes and the highly derived seahorses. Basal forms like Tiktaalik can survive alongside more derived organisms, and we don't expect the transitional forms we find in the fossil record will actually be the literal ancestors of modern groups, rather than a morphological example of our predictions of the anatomy of such organisms.
And you'll often see these big announcements in the newspapers, missing link found. And about 2 months later, you'll find a little footnote where they've retracted it. They don't tell you when they retract it.
I'm going to need a citation for that one.
It's interesting to see what they actually say, the secular scientists. Here was Charles Darwin in 1859. In his book, On the Origin of Species, this is what he said in his chapter 10. Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious and serious objection which can be urged against the theory.
Yep, and now we have numerous intermediate links, as Darwin called them. Turns out that we have discovered a lot of stuff since he wrote.
So he realised there were none of these missing links.
Well, not long after that, Archaeopteryx was found, so he got to see his ideas vindicated in that way before he died.
What was his explanation? The explanation lies, as I believe, in the extreme imperfection of the geologic record. Well, in 1859, they hadn't explored most of the world.
Exactly. Well, humans had, but not the ones who were keeping careful notes about fossils. That was sort of a uniquely European idea at the time, although the Americans were catching up.
So we can excuse Charles Darwin. But what about today, when geologists and scientists have been in every corner of the globe? Has the picture changed at all?
Yeah, dramatically so. Alright, but right now we're going to leave it. We're going to let this whole long historical diatribe as to when we should or shouldn't have found transitional fossils and what various scientists like Darwin and Stephen Jay Gould have to say about it. We're going to leave that for the next time. I hope you've enjoyed this. If you have, please remember to hit like. Again, if you haven't subscribed, it really does help out the channel. And turn on the bell icon and put on all notifications so you're always notified when I have more content out. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. I just want to take a moment to thank my channel members and my patrons on Patreon. They really help keep the lights on here. And I want to thank those pledging $20 or above, especially Bob Knob, Bent Hovend, Ian Chen, Chris Love, Sphincter of Doom, The Venerable Bede, Pat L. Dennis, and Res Instance. Without the support of those whose names you see on screen right now, the channel simply wouldn't exist as it does now, and I certainly wouldn't be able to do 2 to 3 videos a week for over a year and a half now. If you would like to help support and make it so that this channel is something that can keep going, there is a link to join below the video, as well as a link to the Patreon in the channel description. If pledging money isn't right for you, please just hit like on this video, subscribe to the channel, and share my videos. That really helps my channel grow. How